Okay. So thank you very much for the invitation. And well, I'm living here, so I'm happy to be here and to present my work to some external visitors. I'm going to continue to talk about the brain and MRI imaging. As Hannelore, I'm working on multimodal MRI data, and I'm in particular interested in dynamic features of these data. I'm applying these methods to investigate psychosis and schizophrenia in a syndrome called 22q11 deletion syndrome. So what is schizophrenia? I like to argue that most of you have had some kind of experience like that. Imagine you walk down a street like this, dark street, and you have the feeling someone's following you. You're turning around, no one's there. You realize, yeah, okay, this was not real. Or there's some shadow. You think, at the first moment, you think it's a person, but then you realize it's a rubbish bin or something. These hallucinations or delusions, if these get pathological, we call that schizophrenia. And this hugely devastating disease is affecting approximately 1% of the worldwide population. It is a neurodevelopmental disorder that occurs like at early adulthood, between 20 and 30 years old. It's hugely debilitating. So 80% of these patients don't have a job. In the US, around 20% are homeless. And the main problem, we don't know much about the pathophysiology. So we don't know what in the brain is actually wrong in these patients. What we know is that it's affecting the whole brain. So unluckily, there's not a single tumor, some point where we know there's something wrong. It's affecting the brain at the system level, and that's why I'm particularly interested in the dynamics of the brain to analyze this. Another difficulty in these patients is that in studying these patients is that we only have them in the clinical system once they're already diagnosed. So this is why in my lab at the University of Geneva, we're investigating 22q11 deletion syndrome, which is a genetic disease that comes with a broad clinical phenotype. And amongst others, it comes with a very high prevalence of schizophrenia. So the thing is, these patients are diagnosed very early, usually some in childhood, around 5 to 10 years old, before the onset of schizophrenia. But around 40% of these patients will get schizophrenia by adulthood. So it's seen as a human model for the investigation of risk factors for the development of schizophrenia, to find out what's happening before. In my PhD, I'm investigating multimodal MRI, so structural MRI, there's functional MRI, we've already heard about it, and diffusion MRI. I'm particularly interested in functional MRI and diffusion MRI. So in functional MRI, we're measuring brain function, but actually we're not measuring directly the neural activity, but something that's called the BOLD signal, blood oxygenation level dependent signal, which is when there is neural activity in the brain, the oxygenation level in the blood increases because you need energy to do that, and that's what we can measure in the scanner. And in these studies, I've looked at resting state fMRI, so the subjects were lying in the scanner looking at the screen like this for 10 minutes, 8 minutes, and not doing anything in particular. It's pretty boring. When you do that, when you lie in the scanner like this, your brain looks a little bit like this. So there's a lot going on, even if you don't do anything. So red is activity above the average activation, blue is below. So it's quite active. In diffusion MRI, I will just go very quickly, since Hannelore has already mentioned it, we measure the anisotropy in the white matter. From that, we can reconstruct the fibers that are connecting different regions of the brain. And from that, we can reconstruct these structural brain networks where we count how many fibers connect all the regions of the brain. So in my project, as I said, I'm interested in dynamic features of these imaging modalities. So I've been looking at BOLD variability, which is a very global measure of dynamic function, brain function. Then I wanted to go further and use an approach to decompose this brain activity into different networks and to investigate this network brain activity. And in the last study, which is still ongoing, and I'm going to show some preliminary results, I use this structural connectivity information to see how this might have influenced the dynamics that I observe. So first, I'm going to show you what I did about bold variability. So this is basically just the standard deviation of the signal at every point in the brain. The difficulty here is that there are many points in the brain. So this is highly correlated, high-dimensional data. So I used multivariate partial least squares correlation, or PLS, which is a method to extract patterns of altered brain activity. So here, it's basically you compute a correlation between two sets of data. On one side, the brain data. On the other side here, I included the diagnosis and age. And you use singular value decomposition to extract main components of correlations and reflect a main multivariate correlations. This data, I use permutation testing and bootstrapping to evaluate significance and robustness. And in the first study I compared these patients with this 22q11 deletion syndrome to healthy controls and found that they have alterations in a very broad pattern of the brain. In another study, I compared patients with higher psychotic symptoms, because I'm interested in psychosis, and low psychotic symptoms, and found that in particular, this region in the dorsal and anterior cingulate seems to play a role in these patients. It seems to be affected. These results were very interesting to us because the alterations that I observed in the deletion syndrome were laying mainly in these three networks. They're part of a triple network model that was proposed by Vinod Menon in 2011. And he says that brain function is basically characterized by switching between a default mode state, internally oriented, and an externally oriented central executor state that activates when you do something. And there is a salience network that mediates between the two. The anterior cingulate is a central node of this salience network, and we have found alterations in structural MRI, EEG, functional MRI, and DTI already in this region in patients with higher symptoms. And now I could add bold variability to this list of findings. So that's what I wanted to show so far for bold variability. But it's a bit hard to interpret these measures because it's a very global measure. It summarizes the dynamics over the whole scanning time. So I wanted to go a step further and analyze network brain activity. So decompose the brain activity into different networks and analyze their dynamics. To do that, Dimitri Vanderwill and Ishika Anoglu in my lab previously developed an approach that's called innovation-driven co-activations patterns that does this. So it's based on the detection of changing time points of changing activity in the brain. So I want to know at what time the brain has changed significantly. Then I use these time points, I cluster these, and then I get a set of networks and their change points. I have them, and to analyze their dynamics, I have to reproject these to the activity-inducing signal to get the time course for every network. In this last step, when I applied this to my data, I found that there was a small problem. So what we originally did is we just took these patterns and run a linear regression at every time point. So like in these subjects, I have around 200 time points, so I run 200 times this linear regression to get the optimal combination of amplitude of these networks. The problem is these networks are not independent. They're not orthogonal, they're spatially very overlapping, And that's why in the time courses, I observed that there were some weird, spurious activations that had nothing to do with the change points that I observed previously. But with Dimitri, we found a solution. And what we basically do is we use these change points. We know at what time point a network is supposed to change from the clustering. And instead of fitting every time point separately, we force them to be constant between these change points. So we fit the whole block of activation. In that way, we can formulate a problem in one single regression for the whole scanning time for one subject. And I showed on simulated data that we improved the RMSE about a factor of 10, and the co-activations also seem to be much more plausible with this approach. And in this example, this is one subject, by the way. So here we have the time. These are 18 networks and their activation amplitude. So I managed to avoid these weird activations that were probably not actually happening. So now finally, I have the whole framework set up and could go back to my patients. The subject that I showed you before now looks like this. So you can see very nicely how I decomposed the network activity, the activity that we had into networks. So they're different. So each color is a network. They're co-activating, they're disappearing. And from that, I can now simply compute how long they were active. And for two, when I take two networks together, I can check how long of the scanning time they were coupled with the same sign, positively correlated, or anti-coupled with the opposite sign. And when I looked at these measures in the patients with 22q11 deletion syndrome, I found again that the activation of the central executive network, the salience network, and three small networks that can be attributed to the default mode network have reduced activity. So again, this might explain the reduced ball variability that I had observed before. I also wanted to look at the correlation with psychotic symptoms, and I found that in particular the central executive and the salience network are linked to, correlated with psychotic symptoms. And in particular, it seems to be the anti-coupling of the salience with this central executive network that seems to play a role in patients with higher symptoms. So if you remember all these results on the anterior cingulate cortex, I can now, I haven't asked for it, but again, I found this region which is the central hub of the salience network, and could confirm the implication of this region, and I could add the information that it's in particular the anti-coupling with the central executive and the inferior temporal network that play a role for the emergence of psychotic symptoms. So now, as a very last point, I want to show you how I try to include structure into this. So these are all observations of brain function. But an interesting question is, how does the brain structure, so these fiber connection, support these dynamics? And Professor Daniel Bassett at the University of Pennsylvania proposed to use control theory for this. So a bit similar to what we saw before, we assume a model of brain dynamics. This time it's based also on the structural connectivity matrix, but we also allow a control input at every region. And with this approach, we can compute how much energy the brain would need to go from one state, let's say the default mode state, to another, like the central executive, based on its structure. Using this approach, I looked, these are very preliminary, so just the first primer, at persistence energy in a state. So I wanted to know, how much energy does the brain need based on its structure to stay in each of these network states that I extracted from the functional MRI. And I found that, again, in the salience network, the energy is reduced for the patients to stay in this network, and as well in the anterior default mode network and the primary visual network, the energy based on the structure seems to be affected. So again, I found the salience network and the anterior cingulate cortex to be implicated, and this tells me that there is a burned wiring of the brain of these networks, which leads to a change in energy that the brain would need to stay in each of these states, and this may make a bridge to what I already observed in the functional dynamics. So to sum up, I showed you my results on bold variability, which is a very broad measure of brain dynamics. I then went further and used the ICAPS approach to investigate network brain dynamics, and found an implication, confirmed an implication of the salience network. And in the very last few slides that I showed you, I found that the controllability based on the brain structure may have a role in this, because again, same regions are affected. So I'd like to finish with this quote: if the human brain were so simple that we could understand it, we would be so simple that we couldn't. So I know that these are complicated analyses. If it gets to schizophrenia, it's a complex disorder. There's complicated stuff happening in our brain. And I hope that with these studies, I could help a bit to get a better understanding of this disease and to improve the early diagnosis, and for that also the treatment of this illness. So with this, I'd like to thank my two labs, DPFL and the University of Geneva, all the patients who have participated in this study, and you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela. We have cheering people behind. Maybe you have questions also for Daniela. Anyone who wants to start? Thank you for a very interesting talk. So yeah, you said at the end it might be guiding treatments, or I guess it would be super interesting to see medication after, before, different levels of medication, to see. I know this type of medication have to be taken many months. Yeah. It's not simple, but that would be great, isn't it? That you could explore before and after medication.
Medication is a difficult problem because every patient gets his or her individualized set of medication. So some of these patients are already medicated, some are not. Usually we can only report like who's medicated with what, because we don't have the numbers, and it's so individualized, depends on the psychiatrist who treats them and what other problems a person has. But yeah, I totally agree. It's very difficult to disentangle these results from medication effects, because if we have the patients at hand, usually they're medicated.
Could there be animal models where you are more able to change medication, where you replicate the whole framework, but on animal models?
Yeah. There are animal models of this 22q11 deletion syndrome. There's a group in Basel who works on this. They are mostly interested in the hippocampus in particular. I don't know if bold MRI would be the best approach there because of resolution and other differences between a mouse brain and the human brain. But yeah.
Okay, yeah. So, thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey Daniela, great talk. So my question is regarding the data collection process, right? So fMRI recordings that you have, in that duration, do you know if the patient is completely having a normal or is he having a schizophrenic episode during the recording is happening?
No, when the patients, so this is a longitudinal study that has been ongoing since 2001. I think we've been recording MRI since 2005. The patients come back every 3 years. And when the patients are with that, they don't have like psychotic episodes, usually. So even in schizophrenia, like in a person that has full-blown schizophrenia, the episodes are not permanent. So
one more question from the audience. Yes.
I just have a question. Are you thinking also to record EEG in the same time than fMRI?
Because at the same time?
Yeah, in the same time than fMRI. It will bring you better temporal resolution and more information about the dynamical change.
So we are recording EEG in these patients, not at the same time, but in the protocol, they are also like having EEG recordings, resting state, and I think we have a task as well. The difficulty with this longitudinal study is the protocol is very long. They stay for 2 days and get all kinds of psychiatric, cognitive, imaging, everything we can imagine. But changing something in the protocol is very difficult because then we cannot compare with what we have recorded before. So we would have to add this, and of course, I guess it would be promising. But I think the simultaneous EEG and fMRI, there are studies to do it, but mainly on healthy controls to map actually how one translates into the other. So I guess this research should get a bit more advanced to make it useful in a clinical setting, or even maybe we can get rid of the fMRI at some point because we can use it, like use EEG, which would be much more simple. But that's far future, I guess.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Daniela.